Okay, thanks for joining me. We're carrying on Perek Lulav Arava, Masechet Sukkah. We're on page 44a, Mem Daled Amud Aleph, for those of you who are actually following in the Gemara. Mem Daled Amud Aleph, 44a. Just to catch up to where we need to be able to go forward, very brief summary. Just share my screen for a moment with you in order to share a verse in the Chumash. This is the famous foremost verse that deals with Sukkot in the Torah. It deals here with the Arba Minim, and it says, "Ulekachtem lachem b'yom harishon creates hadar kabot tamarim v'anaf eitz avot v'arvei nochal u'samachtem lifnei Hashem Elokeichem shivas yomim." This is the instruction that we have to take the lulav and the esrog and the other two minim. And if you remember, I emphasized on many occasions that the Pasuk actually says b'yom harishon, but it seems that the mitzvah min haTorah to take lulav and esrog is only on the first day of Sukkot and not on the subsequent days. However, the end of the Pasuk seems some way to contradict it, because it says usamachtem lifnei Hashem Elokeichem shivat yomim, that you should celebrate in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu 7 days. From this, Chazal drew a certain conclusion. How can it be 1 day and 7 days? So their conclusion was that if you are lifnei Hashem Elokeichem, this final phrase, if you are in front of Hashem your God, what does that mean? That means you're in the Beis HaMikdash. If that's where you're celebrating, then it's Shivat Yomim. It's a 7-day Chag, including taking the Lulav and Esrog all 7 days. But if you're not at the Beis HaMikdash, then that first part applies to you. L'kachtem lochem b'yom harishon. You only take it on the first day. So that's the way Chazal understood it, that outside the Beis HaMikdash, or according to some views, outside Yerushalayim, the mitzvah Lulav and Esrog is only 1 day. But in the Beis HaMikdash, if you were celebrating there, or according to another view, within the walls of Yerushalayim, you would take Lulav and Esrog all 7 days. Then our Mishnah said, we learned this Mishnah months ago already, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made an institution following the Churban HaBayis, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. He made an institution, Zeicher LeMikdash, in order to commemorate the days when the Beis HaMikdash was with us, that Lulav and Esrog should be taken everywhere, all 7 days. That was Zeicher LeMikdash. So even though the Torah rule only requires it to be taken outside the Beis HaMikdash for 1 day, as a result of this minhag of Zeicher LeMikdash, that we should commemorate the Mikdash, we should hold it dear in our memories, we actually adopt the Beis HaMikdash method and take Lulav and Esrog all 7 days. And indeed, that's what we do today. The fact that we take Lulav and Esrog not just on the first day, but on the other 6 days, is to commemorate the Beis HaMikdash. And it is the takana, the institution of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So that's the situation with the Lulav and Esrog. If you remember, we were dealing with another mitzvah of Sukkot, which is not so well known, which is that of the Arava. And we spent some time talking about the Arava in previous weeks. We finally concluded what the procedure was in the Arava, because there was even a machlokas as to what this Arava mitzvah was. We concluded that some of these very, very long Aravot were taken from a valley in Yerushalayim, and they were taken into the Beis HaMikdash. This was purely a Beis HaMikdash ceremony, and they would be walked around the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach was like the bimmer in the Beis HaKnesses today. They would walk them around, do some hakafot, if you like, of the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash, and then they would set up, they would do as zekifah, they would erect those long aravot against the walls of the Mizbeach, the sides of the Mizbeach overhanging the top of the Mizbeach. And I brought you an illustration of that. So there were 2 components. There was the hakafot with these long aravot, which the Kohanim did around the Mizbeach. because a Zor, a non-Kohen, is not allowed to be in that part of Beis HaMikdash, and then the placing them against the side of the Mizbeach. That was the mitzvah of the Arava. In the Beis HaMikdash, that particular ritual was carried out all 7 days of Sukkot. However, what do we do today? We only carry out some pale reflection of it on the 7th day of Sukkot, which is Hoshana Rabbah. Then we take a specific Arava, not just an Arava which is in our Lulav, but rather a separate set or bunch of Aravot. We elasticate them together, we flail them around a little bit, and then we bash them on the floor a few times. Well, it's a very unusual ceremony. It doesn't seem to be more than a minhag. However, it is supposed to be a commemoration of this Arava ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash. Of course, this beating on the floor may be something which is a bit different, but the very fact that we take a separate Arava on the 7th day, Hoshana Rabbah, is a commemoration of that separate mitzvah of Arava. So the Gemara is now going to ask a question, and it's a very simple question, and I'll take you into the text in a moment. The Gemara is going to ask, if Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made a commemorative takana that the lulav and esrog should be taken all 7 days, Zeichel HaMikdash, even though the Torah says only 1 day, why is it that we don't have a Zeichel HaMikdash all 7 days for the Arava as well? Why is it that we only commemorate that 7th day? Why don't we extend it in the way it was done in the Beis HaMikdash? That's what we're doing with the Arba Minim. So wouldn't it be sensible to do it for the other parallel mitzvah Arava, that we should be doing a Hoshana Rabbah type thing all 7 days of Sukkot, and not just on the 7th day, Zeichel HaMikdash, to commemorate what was done in the Mikdash, when the Arava ceremony was also 7 days. That's where we're going to start the Gemara. Gemara is going to ask that question. So I'm taking you to your sheets or your Gemaras, Mem Dalet Amud Aleph, 7 lines from the top. In the middle of that line, Aleph Lamed Abaye, Amalei Abaye. And this precisely is the question of the Gemara. Let me just stop sharing. This is the question of the Gemara over here. Maishana Lulav to Avdina Le Shiva. Abaye asks this to Rava. Abaye and Rava were very much Chavrutot, if you like, in the Beit HaMedrash. And Abaye asked Rava, why is it different that Lulav to Avdina Le Shiva, that we make a commemoration of the Beis HaMikdash ceremony by taking it all 7 days, Zeichel HaMikdash, Umayshana Arava, why should it be different that in the case of the Arava, the Lo Avdina La Shiva, Zeichel HaMikdash, that we're not making that commemoration also on the Arava mitzvah for all 7 days? Very simple question and a very reasonable and logical question. You'd think that every element of what was done in the Beis HaMikdash on Sukkot, if we're going to be making a commemoration, we should commemorate each and every element, not just the Lulav and Esrog, but also that of Arava. So Rava responds, Amalei. So Rava responds to Abaye, here's my answer. Hoil ba'adam yotze yedei chavoso ba'arava sheba lulav. Now, this at first sight is going to be a very, very surprising answer, and the Gemara is going to have to qualify it because it doesn't seem to make sense. The Gemara's answer is simply this. In Alulavim, we have 3 Hadassim, and we have 2 Aravot. So we have Aravas already within the bundle of Alulav. Says Abaye, says Rava to Abaye, you know what? In a sense, we are commemorating the Arava ceremony for all 7 days. We're doing so within the bundle of the Lulav itself. Since the Lulav itself contains Aravot, when we pick up the Lulav and Esrog and we make a bracha on our Lulav, we are not only fulfilling the mitzvah of Lulav, we're also commemorating the mitzvah of the Arava, because the Arava is a component within the Lulav bundle. Very unusual. In other words, I shouldn't really use this expression because it's not very appropriate. You know, we kill 2 birds with 1 stone, essentially. We pick up the Lulav contains Aravot, and therefore it's not only there as a constituent of the lulav ceremony. It is also there as the component of the arava ceremony. And since we take lulav all 7 days, let's ignore Shabbat for a moment. Since we take it all 7 days, we are commemorating Zecher Mikdash, not just the lulav all 7 days, but also the arava. That's his answer. Now, that's an answer that should really surprise you, because generally we don't bundle up mitzvot. We don't try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I know it might be very convenient practically, but it's an insult to a mitzvah to essentially say, you know what, this commemorates 2 things. Rather than me doing 2 separate things, I'm doing so and I'm saving time. For example, you wouldn't dream of having one of these South Korean multiple wedding ceremonies under one sukkah or under one canopy. Why not? Let's have 40 married couples getting married together under the same chuppah, 1 set of Sheva brachos, 1 glass of wine, and that's it. They're all married at once. Would that work? Now, people would say, no, it should not be done. Why we say, ein osim mitzvahs chavilas chavilas. We don't try to bundle mitzvahs together in a way that looks as though we're trying to mass produce them or to do them wholesale. It's a bizoyan, it's a disgrace to the mitzvah. And over here, it seems that we're not offering proper respect to the arava mitzvah because we're trying to do it as part and parcel of another mitzvah. So it's a surprising answer that Robert gives Abai. So, of course, Abai is not going to be happy with the answer, in the same way as I'm not happy, and I hope you're not happy with the answer. Oh, we're getting it done within the arava, within our lulav. Abai responds to Rabba, and he says, how can you say that that's the case? Hahu mishum lulav hu duka ovid lei. The arava in the bundle, together with a lulav, is there as part of the lulav mitzvah. And it's not there as a separate mitzvah for the arava. How can you try and combine one ritual element and say that it represents 2 different functions? How can you do such a thing? And he goes further and he says, V'chi teima. And if you would want to say to me, it works. Why does it work? Because the komagbalei v'hada magbalei. This is a little trick in halacha, that the person who takes the lulav, what he does is he picks it up first and he says, so to speak, l'shem mitzvahs lulav ve'esra. Then he puts it down again. Then he picks up his lulav again and he says, l'shem arava, because the arava is also in the lulav. So by picking up the lulav, he picks up the arava, which is within the same pouch. If you want to say that's what a person can do, and that's the way you get away with it, because you're essentially doing 2 separate ceremonies, maybe consecutively, but with the same lulav, which carries the arava. And that's why you can be yotze both mitzvahs with the arava in the lulav. And we'll see later on in the Gemara, there is such an opinion that if you were to pick up a lulav twice, once with the intention that you're doing so for the mitzvah of the lulav itself, the arba minim, and once for the intention of being somehow mekayim the minhag of arava, then it's possible you could get away with saying that's, you can use the same tool, so to speak, for 2 functions. It's possible to say that, but Abai says that's not really what's happening in the world, because right, he actually says, Ma'asem b'chol yom means everybody can see every day of Sukkot that no one does this. In other words, really Abai is admitting to Rava, if it were really true that a person were to pick up the lulav twice and he were to say to himself, the first time I'm picking this up for the sake of the lulav ceremony, and the second time he picks it up again, he has in his mind, he's picking it up with a kavana for the arava, then I might almost accept that's why we don't use a separate arava, we don't do Hashon arava all 7 days, because we're doing it within the lulav and we're doing it twice each day, and therefore it is, in a sense, we are performing the separate arava ceremony as well, if that were to be the case. But says Abaye, no one does that. How many people do you see in shul during the 4th day of Sukkot who picks up you may pick up the lulav many times anyway, but you certainly don't say to yourself, by the way, on this occasion, I'm raising the lulav in order to raise the arava, in order to be yoked to the mitzvah arava, zecha the mikdash. How many people say that? They don't. So if that's the case, there is no way, says Abaye to Rava, that you can get away with answering the question you've done, which is to say that the reason we don't do the Arava ceremony all 7 days today is that in fact we get away with it because it's within the lulav, and we are essentially doing it. We're doing it by having it in the lulav because we don't pick it up twice with two separate intentions. So I say again, he asks, why is it that we don't commemorate the Arava ceremony all 7 days? We're not doing it within the lulav. Why don't we do it separately? Why isn't there a Hashana Rabbah halacha every day? After we've done the hakokos with the lulav and esrog, we should take another bundle of those 5 or whatever it is that we do today and do it not just on Hoshana Rabbah, but on the earlier days of Sukkot as well. Why don't we do that? So the Gemara gives another answer now, which is a little bit easier to understand. Why it is that we're not commemorating the Arava ceremony for all 7 days, and yet we are commemorating Zeichel Mikdash the Lulav. He says, because there's a difference. Don't bring me Lulav and say it needs to be the same for the Arava ceremony. So Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei Rava, Lulav de Araisa of Dinan Shiva Zeichel Mikdash. Arava de Rabbanon, Lo Dinan La Shiva Zeichel Mikdash. And this is going to be also a difficult answer, as we'll see in a moment. It's not at all be straightforward. The Gemara is saying something which seems to be quite simple. Rav Zvid. The lulav, the mitzvah of lulav and esrog, is mefurish min haTorah. I showed you the posuk, lekachtem lachem b'yom harishon, pri etz hodav kapos tomarim, etc. That is a posuk that teaches us the din of arba minim, which includes the lulav. And so therefore it's specifically, and it's explicitly min haTorah. So for such a mitzvah that carries the significance of being a Torah mitzvah, we will do all 7 days Zeichel Mikdash, because it has such chashivut, it has such importance, such significance that it's a Torah mitzvah. And if it's a Torah mitzvah, even though there is no Beis HaMikdash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said Zeichel Mikdash, do it all 7 days, but that's only because it's a Torah mitzvah. But well, let's get now to Arava. Now this is going to be problematic, because what is the source of the mitzvah of the Arava? This ceremony that they brought it up from Mozart and they put it on the sides of the Mizbeach, and in the Beis HaMikdash they would go around the Mizbeach 7 days. It's not to be found in this posuk at all, certainly not at a simple glance. And if that's the case, Rav Zvid wants to say it's rabbinic. And if it's rabbinic, there's no need to make a Zeichel Mikdash. If you're going to commemorate something forever and ever in an extended fashion, like you're going to take 7 days instead of 1 day, you would do so for something that's very significant. You wouldn't commemorate something that was less significant. So Rav Zvid is telling us, since the mitzvah Arava does not have the significance of lulav and esrog, it's only rabbinic. It's not something, therefore, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai felt it was necessary to commemorate. You commemorate the essentials. You don't commemorate something which is only an add-on. And the Arava ceremony, says Rav Zvid, is only midrabbanan. Now, the Gemara is going to challenge this in a moment, very, very strongly. Because remember, did we not have all this discussion a few weeks ago where we said that the Chachamim wanted to show how important the mitzvah of Arava was, because the Baisusim, the Boethesians, they didn't take it seriously at all, and they hid the Aravos in the Beis HaMikdash. They didn't think it was Derech Shabbos because they said it was not a mitzvah in our Torah, and therefore Chazal said that even if the 7th day falls on a Shabbos, it should be taken just to show its significance, that it does have Torah force. So we previously discussed the fact that the Arava has Torah force. So how can Rav Zvid say that it doesn't, it's just rabbinic? That goes against what we learned before. And the Gemara is now going to remind us of this. That's what the Gemara is going to remind us now. That how Rav Zvid has just said this is rabbinic. It's a mitzvah drabanan, and a mitzvah drabanan is something that's instituted by the rabbis that has no textual source or no strong masoret, no strong tradition. And yet we find that is not the case. And this is how the Gemara is going to question it. Laman, says the Gemara, according to which opinion, Rav Zvid, are you suggesting that the mitzvah Ravah is only rabbinic. And the Gemara is going to give us two sets of opinions, neither of which hold that the mitzvah arava is rabbinic. It does have Torah force of some sort, and therefore there should be no distinction between arava and lulav and esrog. Let's see what these two different opinions are. Says the Gemara, if you are holding like the opinion of the Tana Abba Shaul, this is Rav Zvid and Amora, and he's going back to the source opinions in the Tanaitic literature. And he says, let's try Abba Shaul. He's one major authority. And what did he say? Ha'amar, he said, did he not? Arvei nachal kesiv shtayim achas lelulav v'achas lemikdash. Let me take you back to the pasuk again. This is a very unusual drasha, by the way, and I'm not sure that this is the way we would normally hold. But let me take you back to the pasuk. This is why I magnified Arvei nachal over here. Arvei nachal are the aravot. This is the pasuk that teaches us about arba minim in general. There's nothing specific in here that deals with the mitzvah of arava, this special arava ceremony of the Kohanim. However, when you read the pasuk and it says lekachtem lachem b'yom harishon, creates hadar, v'kapot tomarim, v'anafei tzavot are the hadassim, v'arvei nochal are the aravim, u'samachtem ifnei Hashem lekechem shivas yamin. Now, as I explained to you before, this is simply the general pasuk that deals with the taking of the arba minim. However, there's an exceptional opinion here of Abba Shaul. And Abba Shaul says, it says v'arvei nochal. Yes, it actually only says v'anaf eitzavos. In terms of the hadassim, it doesn't say there needs to be more than one. This is the Torah source, not what we nowadays do, 3 and 2 on hadassim and aravot. But in terms of how the Torah writes it, it seems that it's sufficient to have one hadas, and it says v'arvei nochal. Now it doesn't say the arav nochal. It doesn't say a single arava. Arvei nochal means, as the translation is, willows of the brook. So there seems to be an allusion here in the Torah pasuk to 2 aravot. Now, I mean, you might just say to me, well, all that means is when you fulfill the mitzvah of arba minim, then you should have 2 aravot in your bundle. But that's not the way Abba Shaul learns it. Abba Shaul says the reason there is this plural here for arvei nochal is because you should take on Sukkot 2 aravot. Maybe one of them will go into your lulav, and that's your lulav package together with your hadas, minimally min haTorah. And then you make the mitzvah of lulav and esrog, and you've been mekayim, you fulfilled the mitzvah. You take another arav, another willow branch, because it says v'arvei. You take the second one, and that is a Torah rule, a Torah source for the taking of the arava in the Beis Hamikdash, actually, because it says smachtim b'nei Hashem lekechem shivas yomim. So you could see that as relating to the Kohanim. In other words, the Kohanim would have an allusion to taking it 7 days in the Mikdash, not just the lulav and esrog, but also that extra arava as part of the separate arava ceremony. All of a sudden, Abba Shaul has found a Torah source for the mitzvah of arava. That's also taken 7 days in the Beis Hamikdash, and it's not a minhag neviim. It's not a chazal. It's not a takonos chachamim at all. It's not drabonim. It's deoraita. That's Abba Shaul's opinion. So the Gemara says, just go back. The Gemara is saying over here, if one holds or subscribes to Abba Shaul's opinion, then certainly the mitzvah Rabbah is min haTorah and has the same status as the status of taking arba minim, lulav and esrog. Now, that bit is only done maybe by the Kohanim, but it has Torah status. And if it has Torah status, comes back the question, why do we deal with it differently than lulav? Lulav, we made a zeicha lemikdash, that it should be taken outside the Beit HaMikdash all 7 days. We should have made that same zeicha for the arava, because it has Torah force, and yet we don't. We only do it on Hoshana Rabbah. Now you'll tell me maybe we don't go like Abba Shol. So the Gemara gives you the second alternative. Okay. L'Rabbanon, that if you say that we should follow the opinion of the other Tanoim who don't agree with Abba Shol, they don't make the same conclusion from this posuk that Arvei Nochal includes one Arava for the Arava ceremony, the separate Arava ceremony. They don't hold like that at all. It is a little bit difficult to understand Abba Shol's drasha, but they still hold it has Torah force for a different reason. Why? Because Hilchasa Gemiri law, they hold that it is a Hilchasa. Whenever the Gemara refers to Hilchasa, it means Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, which the Gemara is going to prove in a moment. In other words, if you hold like Abba Shol, it's in the text of the Chumash, it's Min HaTorah. If you don't hold like Abba Shol, the only other opinion is that it's Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. Halacha L'Moshe Misinai is a tradition, and it's a tradition that carries Torah force, even if it's not in the text of the Apostle. So therefore, even according to the other Rabbanon, there's no way you can say that the Arava is only a mitzvah drabonon. It's not a mitzvah drabonon. It's at worst, or at least, it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And therefore also it should be commemorated all 7 days. It has the force of a Torah mitzvah. So why don't we commemorate it all 7 days? Now the Gemara is going to prove that there's a source for the Arava, not according to Abba Shol, but the other Tanoim, that is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Now we see the Gemara says, to Amar Rabbi Asli, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Nechunya, Ish Bikat Beit Chorton. That's where he came from. There's an Nechunya. Rabbi Nechunya was from the valley of Beit Chorton. What did he say? Let's first read what he said, because these are a little bit tricky. Esenetios, the 10 saplings, Arava, the mitzvah Arava, that's the one that should stand out for us. The mitzvah Arava, about which we're talking about, the Nisuch HaMayim, and the whole ceremony of Nisuch HaMayim, also during the days of Sukkot, where they used to take water up from the pool, the Shiloh pool, and bring it up and pour it over the Mizbeach top. All these three are halacha l'Moshe Misinai. And the important takeaway from here is that we have a genuine source that, at least according to another major opinion, Arava, which is the second one of this triplet, is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, which means it carries Torah force. So it's not midrabanon, and if it's not midrabanon, it has the Torah force. We should be commemorating it all 7 days, and not just on Hoshana Rabbah. That remains to be the question right now. But let me just go through some of these cases. The first case is the one that we don't know about. What's the case of Esenetios? Just on the tangent, really, because it doesn't affect our learning of the Gemara over here, but as we meet a new topic in the Gemara, as it's brought in, at least we should have a little bit of a idea of what it really represents. It's a Shemitah halacha, and it's quite a complicated Shemitah halacha, and I don't claim to understand even some of the simple Shemitah halachas nowadays. They're very confusing. But in essence, for some of the laws of Shemitah, the prohibitions against working the land start even before the Rosh Hashanah, in which the Shemitah year commences. In fact, for many of these, at least during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they started 30 days before the Rosh Hashanah came in. It's a bit like Tosfos Yom Kippur. When we start Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, a few minutes earlier, we add from the secular day to make Yom Kippur a little bit longer. It's like a mitzvah to extend Yom Kippur, and some people have a mitzvah to extend Motzei Shabbos also after Motzei Shabbos, the Rabbeinu Tam, etc. There was also a mitzvah to begin early some of the laws and prohibitions of Shemitah. Now, there are laws that relate to looking after trees, fruit trees, for example, from which you would normally take fruit. And the halacha is that you shouldn't really do stuff that will benefit the tree. You may do stuff that will stop it completely falling to pieces, but you shouldn't do stuff that will benefit the trees in the Shemitah year, and even in the 30 days before the Shemitah year comes out, commences. However, the halacha, as stated, of Eser Netios is that in the 30 days prior to Shemitah year, you are allowed to do some work in the land around the tree, around the roots of the tree, that are necessary in order to support these saplings. Saplings are young trees that haven't yet completely taken full root and are at risk of dying if they're not treated well. Whereas an immature tree, even if you were to ignore it for a while, isn't going to necessarily lose you the benefit of the tree and the fruit. But a sapling, you need to be more careful. And Chazal said in this Eser Netios, they learned this from Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, that's what we're saying. There's Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, that you can do a certain amount of work around saplings under certain conditions. So what are the certain conditions? If you have 10 sapling trees within an area of field of 50 amos by 50 amos, 2,500 square amos, then you're allowed to plow and work the whole field to soften the earth so that the roots of the trees can obtain whatever nutrition they need. Did I make that myself clear? Probably not. So let me just draw a little diagram. And I'm going to use the whiteboard, which I haven't used now for probably a year and a half. Do you remember the whiteboard? Maybe you don't. Okay, so let's say we have a field. I'm terrible at straight lines. Okay. And let's say that it is 50 amos by 50 amos. So 50 amos is about 75 feet. All right. And let's say there are 10 trees in there. It's actually quite difficult to do 10 trees, but if they're symmetrically, yeah, these are trees. Whoops. I'll draw the 10th in some random position because I've only drawn 9. Okay, there's 10. If there are 10 trees and they're within this area of 50 by 50, or if you like, if there are 10 trees within any area of 2,500 square amos, it doesn't have to be square, it could be rectangular or something else, then the halacha is that you can plow up or dig up anywhere within this field in order to benefit the trees. In other words, you could take your tractor, one second, let me just see if I can change the color of my pen. I can't find the pen machine coloring. Oh, this is interesting. Oh, there we are. Okay. So here you've got a tractor and it's working on the field. The tractor could be here, could be here, it could be anywhere on the field. Even though you're a little bit away from the trees that need the nourishment, if the field is 50 by 50, in which there are 10, there is sufficient concentration of trees within that designated area that Chazal say that if you work on any place in order to help those trees, then you will be giving direct benefit to those trees, and you will not be giving benefit to a part of the field that doesn't actually reach those trees. Let's say that the contrasting case will make it clearer. If there were only 3 trees here, let's say there were 3 trees. Let's say you didn't have these, and you didn't have these, and there were only 3 trees within this area, then Chazal say this 10 rule doesn't apply. What are you allowed to do? You've got 3 trees and they're young trees and you want to make sure that they get the nourishment they need. That might mean digging trenches around and softening the earth. Then you're only allowed to work within a specific area of those isolated trees. let's say I'm giving you some boundaries over here, because only that area is what the roots of those trees are going to draw from. However, if you wish to just take your lawnmower or your trench digger and work here, you wouldn't be allowed to, because we say that that path isn't necessarily working to the benefit of those trees, and we're only giving you a heter, a waiver, in order to benefit those trees. So in other words, the rule is there has to be sufficient concentration of trees within a confined space to allow you to work the whole field without actually measuring how much around each tree you're allowed to work. If it doesn't fulfill this condition, then you're only allowed to work within a small proximity of each tree. Well, you might say, well, that's a very detailed rule. And it is a very detailed rule. However, stop sharing for a moment. The din of Esa Natius, surprisingly enough, says that that complex rule, which gives you a waiver for working the whole extent of the field as long as there is a sufficient concentration of trees within that area, that waiver is granted by Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Isn't that strange? You might have thought it was an agriculturalist who made up that rule, because there is logic behind that. I mean, not the numbers necessarily, but the idea that you shouldn't work in a field outside the area where the roots are likely to extend. This rule that we have, this Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, in a sense, relies on the fact that the roots of trees don't need to draw in nourishment from further than a certain distance from the base of the tree. And this rule is giving you, this is a magic rule that tells you how far you don't need to worry about working the ground, because we say it's all within the catchment area of the roots of the trees. You'd be surprised to learn now that this is Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There are only a certain number of, this has always been very surprising, there are only a certain number of scores of Halacha l'Moshe Sinai in the whole of the annals of Jewish halachic literature. And you'd have thought that these would be reserved for very important traditions. And yet over here, you have an example of Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, what seems to be a detail of a detail of a detail of Shemitah. Isn't that strange? But we've met it before, by the way. We've met this before in Masechet Sukkah. Do you remember when we were looking at various of the rules about walls around the Sukkah? There are all sorts of weird and wonderful rules about Dofan Akuma, imagining the wall to curve round and meeting the schach if there's less than a certain distance from where the walls meet the roof. We talked about the fact that fencing, which is less than 3 tefachim apart, is considered to be closed. We talked about the fact that if you have an incomplete wall that doesn't come down all the way from the roof to the ground, there is a din that imagines that it goes down to the ground halachically, even though it doesn't. Or if it doesn't go all the way up to the schach, we imagine it goes well up to schach. All those are rules Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And then again, you can say, well, what is Moshe, whoever invented Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, doing working on such details on traditions? You'd think they'd be reserved to matters of great national importance, but that's not the case. I can't answer why it is that Halacha l'Moshe Sinai is reserved for some of those details. It's one of those mysteries. And this Esa Natius, which is a detail of a detail in Hilchos Shemitah, is also a Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But for our purposes over here, coming back to the thrust and parry of our Gemara, Arava is stated here as being one of those Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, according to this second opinion, which is to say that it is a tradition that has come down from Sinai. We may not find it in the text, unlike Abba Shaul, who says we can, but nevertheless, it carries Torah force, which brought back again the question of why we don't commemorate it all 7 days. Okay, all right, so let's go back to the Gemara, to our page. Ela Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei de Rava. Rav Zvid said in the name of Rava, Lulav de Islay Ika min HaTorah Bigvulin of Dinon Le Shiva Zecha LeMikdash. Arava de Lesla Ika min HaTorah Bigvulin Lo of Dinon Shiva Zecha LeMikdash. Rav Zvid's going to give you a difference between Lulav and Arava to explain why we commemorate the lulav all 7 days, even though Min HaTorah you only need 1 day? Why do we make a Zeicha LeMikdash extension for lulav and yet not for Arava, which we've agreed is on the same status level? It's Halacha LeMoshe Sinai, or it's Mefurash Min HaTorah. So why didn't we extend that for all 7 days as well? Says Rav Zavid, there is a difference. The difference isn't whether it's Deraisa or Drabonon or what. No, it's a difference in the way in which both of these mitzvahs apply, and they apply differently. The mitzvah of lulav, which was done all 7 days of the Mikdash, but nevertheless, there was a din of lulav outside the Beis HaMikdash. Even if you were living in Siberia, you would take the lulav at least on the first day, right? It says, L'kachtem lachem b'yom harishon. So outside the Beis HaMikdash, there was always a din of lulav. In other words, the din of lulav is universal. It applies across the globe. It is Min HaTorah, but then so is Arava. But lulav is universally applicable across all the geographical zones. However, let's look at Arava. Arava, according to our Halacha LeMoshe Sinai as well, was only originally in the Beis HaMikdash. There was no din of Arava originally outside the Beis HaMikdash. The fact that we make a zeicha on the 7th day is a zeicha on the 7th day, but it's not because it was done at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. At the time of the Beis HaMikdash, as I described to you, they took up, the Kohanim came down to the valley of Mozah, they took up these large aravot and took them to the Beis HaMikdash. That was the only place in the world that the aravah ceremony was carried out. So the aravah ceremony was geographically confined only to the Beis HaMikdash. The lulav had no confinement. It was universally applied. So he now says the reason we commemorate all 7 days for lulav is because it's really a mitzvah of a higher order. It's a mitzvah that was carried out across the globe. And therefore, your Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, since this is a universal rule, and don't forget, most Jews are living in Chutz La'aretz, and it was a mitzvah that was originally done at least on the first day of Chutz La'aretz, let's continue it for the next 6 days as well. And therefore he made a Zeicha LeMikdash. But the din of Arava was always confined only to the Beis HaMikdash. And because it was only confined to the Beis HaMikdash, and people outside the Beis HaMikdash never saw it. After the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, the people are just outside the Beis HaMikdash. They've never done the mitzvah Rabbah before. So to them, we say we don't make a commemoration all 7 days. We give them Hoshana Rabbah, but we don't make it a whole 7-day thing. Lulav is something we've always practiced, at least on the first day, Min HaTorah. It's a universal mitzvah, extended for all 7 days as Zeicha LeMikdash. Arava is not universal, and therefore it was not extended. That is the chiluk, the distinction that Rav Zavid makes between Lulav and Arava, to explain why we take today the lulav and esrog all 7 days, if you like, even though mitzvah is only 1 day Min HaTorah, to commemorate the Beis HaMikdash. But the Arava, somehow we weekly represent it on the 7th day only. And even then, as I say, our ceremony today with the Arava is very different to what we found the ceremony was in the Beis HaMikdash. Where they have these giant aravot. It's not like that at all. We have a small arava, etc. So our ceremony is a little bit different as well. Okay. The Gemara is going to bring a related matter now, which is interesting historically as well. And it's in relation to the Arava ceremony. I think at this point, we sort of settled the reason why we don't take 7 days for the Arava. We found the distinction that seems to be agreed on between Arava and Lulav and Esrog. But we're now going to focus more on the Arava ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash itself, and see what it was that the Kohanim were doing. We're going to now home in on the ceremony. Omer Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish said the following: Kohanim Baalei Mumin Nichnasin Bein HaUlam VeLaMizbeach Gedei Lotzeis Ba'arava. He's adding a gloss here to what a Kohen can normally do. Reish Lakish is giving us an insight to the ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash, and he's giving us really a bit of a chiddush. remember what we said before, that the original Arava ceremony, certainly the way according to we concluded it last week, was that the Kohanim brought up these Aravot. They then circumnavigated the Mizbeach a few times. That was their holding and the Hakofot around the Mizbeach. And then they erected these tall Aravot against the side of the Mizbeach to overhang the Mizbeach, which was really quite tall. That was the ceremony, the way we understood it, although we did go through some trial and errors before we understood it that way. That was the way we finally understood the mitzvah of the Aravot. So who goes around with the Aravot before they're erected against the side of the Mizbeach? Who does the circumnavigation? Who does the Hakafot? Kohanim only, because only the Kohanim are allowed to be there. So the Reish Lakish is saying something quite surprising. Normally, when it comes to the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, that is the service of the sacrifices, the Kohanim who are eligible to carry out the Avodah have to be Kohanim who don't have a mum, a blemish. The Torah lists several types of blemish, mumim, that disqualify a Kohen from doing the Avodah. We can talk about what the reason is, why that should be the case, and there's a lot of discussion on that, but that is nevertheless a requirement. A Kohen who has a mum, a certain type of mum, if it's a temporary mum, then he has to wait until he's better. But if he has this mum, he has, I don't know, he has a split lip, or he has a problem with his nose, or whatever it is, it's bulbous, I can't tell you all these strange mumim, then he's not allowed to carry out the Avodah. However, there's certain things he can still do. And Reish Lakish is telling us that a Baal Mum is allowed to take part in the ceremony of the Aravot. He's not disqualified from that. So if, he's right, rather like having a cup of the Sefer Torah, he picks up one of these Aravot, one of these long Aravot, and he is privileged to be able to circumnavigate the Mizbeach, even though he is a Baal Mum. That's the first thing he's telling us. And not only is he allowed to circumnavigate the Mizbeach, he's even allowed to travel around the Mizbeach in a part of the Azara, which is the most holy, which is between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. He doesn't have to stop at a certain point and then hand over his Arava to somebody else, like someone carrying a heavy Sefer Torah on Simchat Torah. He can do the whole loop, including the most sensitive and kadosh parts of the Beis Hamikdash. So I'll share our screen with you here and show you what we're talking about. Here we have a classic picture of the Beis Hamikdash. Now I try to align it. It's very complicated, and I'm not going to apologize for it because it is complicated. I've aligned it so that if you can imagine a line over here, or you imagine this wall over here, it's not quite right that it's this wall, but you can imagine this wall to be the Kotel Maravi, right? So if you're standing over here on saying your Kriya Shema or your Amida, essentially you're at this point and you're looking at the Beis Hamikdash in that configuration. What is immediately beyond the wall is where the Heichal and the Ulam used to be. You are seeing this as a helicopter view, right? It's a zoom view from on top. And so this is the roof, looks like a pair of tefillin upside down, but it isn't. It's a zoom view. This is the Ulam. I'm going to magnify it a little bit for you. Marvels of modern technology. I've zoomed in. Oh, I've lost it. So this section here, it's a little curtained off section, is the Kodesh HaKodeshim. If only we could see through the walls to where this building used to stand. It's really not too far from where the Kotel is today. This part is where the Aron used to be. This part is called the Ulam, the hall. And in the hall here, there was the Shulchan, that special table. There was some extra menorot, and there was the Mizbeach HaZahav, Hanachoshes, the copper altar, and a few other bits and pieces, right? Whereas this Kodesh Kodashim, where the Aron was the holiest of the holiest. In the second Beis Hamikdash, there was no Aron HaKodesh there, but it was still compartmentalized. And you would go through the Ulam, through the edge of a curtain into the Beis Hamikdash, into the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's how the Kohen Gadol would make his way into the Kodesh HaKodashim. Here's the entrance into the Ulam. First of all, there are some chambers. The main doors are over here. This was hugely high, very impressive facade. If you can imagine, you'd be looking down on a huge facade. If you were standing over here, you'd be looking at the facade. If you're at Coastal Amarabi, you'd just be seeing the back of this enormous building. Okay, this whole building is called the Heichal, the sanctuary, this whole building. So here's the Kodesh Kodashim, here's the Ulam, and this whole building is called the Heichal, the sanctuary building. Okay. This whole area around the sanctuary building, within these walls, this whole area, including the area where this is, the Mizbeach, which we'll talk about in a moment, is called the Azara. And only the Kohanim were allowed to enter into here. If we go further into this direction, you see there's Rat Nashim, the women came in over here, there were various chambers, there were steps and columns, etc. However, in this area, once you came through here, into anywhere in this area, Kohanim only. You can actually see over here, there are pegs where they used to tie the animals that were to be shechted for the korbanos so that they didn't struggle. Then they used to take them. They would walk around here. Here's the ramp. Make this even bigger. Whoops, I'm not sure whether you can see it now. I may have lost it for you. Oh, here we are. Right. So this is a ramp. It's an ascending ramp. The Kohanim would come round with bits of the animal that were to be burnt on the Mizbeach. They'd have to come round here. They would walk up the ramp. And therefore, this is at an elevation. This is the elevated roof of the Mizbeach. And there was a pyre of wood. That's the pyre of wood that's burning. And they would place the various korbanos on here. This is large. You know, it's like 30 feet, 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet, or whatever it is. It's a large area on top. So they could actually walk around the edges and drop the burning, drop the animal flesh into the fire. Okay, so this is a ramp, remember. What was the ceremony there for the Aravot? So they would take the Aravot up and they would bring them in, possibly through the Ezrat Noshim, through over here. The Kohanim would hold them, take them here, and then they would first do their hakofot. Through this helicopter view, they would go around here, whether they go around here 5 times, 7 times, 33 times, I have no idea. That's not clear. They wouldn't necessarily do it 7 times as we tend to have hakofot, but they would certainly go around. And at the end of that circumnavigation, they would pile up their aravot, as I showed you, vertically stack them against the walls of the Mizbeach. And that was the ceremony. This area here is the area between the Heichal and the Mizbeach. And therefore this area, I'm sort of trying to draw it with my cursor, is the most holy part of the Azora. It's designated as such. And normally, Reish Lakish would say that a Kohen with a mum, with a blemish, should avoid this area. Yes, he would normally be allowed to walk through the Azora. He isn't doing the Avodah, but with the Aravot, but he would have to stop here. Or we'd have to stop here. But in this area here, he would really have to give it over. However, Reish Lakish said no. He says a special privilege was granted to the Baalei Mumin. They would even be allowed to take their Aravot and walk within this area between the Heichal and the Mizbeach. That's what Reish Lakish, or he calls it the Ulam, because this is the Ulam. But it's this area here, which is the holiest area. Reish Lakish says that's okay. They can carry their lulav and esrog. They can carry these aravot even in that designated holy area. Okay, that's what he said. Why? Because the mitzvah of aravah is such a dear mitzvah, and this is not considered to be part of really one of the avodot, one of the real sacrificial type services of the Beis Hamikdash. So Baal Mum, even though he's a Baal Mum, this Kohen is still allowed to go around, and he's even allowed to go around in that area. Okay, so Amalei Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan, who is the sparring partner of Reish Lakish in all these discussions, he said to Reish Lakish, Mi Amara, who told you this? Reish Lakish has just given us halach as if he was in the Beis Hamikdash. Reish Lakish lived 200 years, 150 years after the Chorban Habayis, and he's telling us that the Kohanim, they even those that had mumim would be allowed to carry the arovat between the ulam and the mizbeach. So says Rabbi Yochanan, Mi Amara, who said so? Have you got a video? Have you got a tradition? So finally, the Gemara actually says, Mi Amara, says the Gemara, Ha'ihu Amar. You yourself, Rabbi Yochanan, said something very similar. Don't ask me who said it, you said it. What did you say? He himself, Rabbi Yochanan, said to Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishim Rabbi Nechunya Ish Bikat Beit Chorotam. You are quoted as saying in the name of another Chacham, but you said it, Esa Netios, the 10 Netios, Arava, Nisuch HaMayim, Halocha LaMoshe MiSinai. That actually has Rabbi Yochanan's name in. What does this mean? It simply means that Arava, even that Rabbi Yochanan agrees himself, is Halocha LaMoshe MiSinai. And therefore, Reish Lakish is saying to Rabbi Yochanan, and this is really not so clear, as Rabbi Yochanan is going to retort in a moment, essentially, if you agree, and you do, it seems, agree, that the mitzvah, the ceremony of the Aravah, is Halacha LaMoshe MiSinai, it carries Torah force, then isn't it obvious that you would agree that a Baal Mum, because it's such an important ceremony at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, would be allowed to go and carry the Aravah between the Olav and the Mizbeach? You might not think it's so obvious. And Rabbi Yochanan himself answers it's not so obvious. Rabbi Reish Lakish seems to think it goes together. Once you say this is such an important mitzvah, and it's not just a minhag, and this is not really an avodah of a korban, then why shouldn't a Baal Mum be able to go around between the Ulam and the Mizbeach? If you said it was only a mitzvah midrabanan, then I'd understand. Maybe you would say, okay, better that a Baal Mum doesn't do it. But once you say it carries the force of Torah, then surely a Baal Mum should be able to do it as well. Shouldn't he also a Kohen? He doesn't lose his kahuna just because he's not allowed to practice on the Mizbeach. So why shouldn't he be able to carry it? So it says, the Gemara says no. Ella mi amaran. There's a couple of things that need to be clarified before you can assume that Rabbi Yochanan would agree, just because it says that Halacha Moshe MiSinai, that he would agree that a Baal Mum would be able to carry it around this area. First of all, mi amara binatila dilma. Trying to find it again. Bizakifa. This is the old hot potato we tossed about some weeks ago. We thought we'd finished with this. It suddenly comes back to hit us again. Sometimes it does. So the first in the Gemara says, well, first of all, who says that the ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash involved hakafos around the Mizbeach? Maybe it only involved erecting these aravas against the side of the Mizbeach. We thought we'd sorted that out, but at this point, the Gemara doesn't think so again. Let's assume the Gemara is not sure. Therefore, if the ceremony never involved carrying the aravas around the Mizbeach, then Rabbi Yochanan is saying, Reish Lakish, what are you talking about? Saying that a Baal Mum is allowed to carry the aravas around the Mizbeach. That wasn't part of the procedure. The procedure was simply to place the aravas against the side of Mizbeach. It only takes one Kohen to do that. He doesn't have to be a Baal Mum. It doesn't need all the Kohanim carrying lots of aravas. One just places it in the right positions, and that's it. So then you wouldn't need a Baal Mum. It could be there is no need to circumnavigate the Mizbeach in the first place. And if you don't need to circumnavigate, you don't need to be in the position between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. So that's the first possibility, that doesn't require a Baal Mum at all, and he has no such privileges because that's not part of the procedure at all of the Aravah. Maybe it's only Zakifa. And furthermore, mi amar Baal Mumin dilma bitmimin. Even if you were to say, again, the alternative, that it did include the hakafot, that it did include the circumnavigation of the Mizbeach. Kohanim went around with these hakafot. Who's to say that we would allow Balei Mumin to do it? In other words, Rabbi Yochanan would be saying this to Reish Lakish. Let's assume that there is a ceremony of hakafot with the Aravah around. Let's just assume that that's the case you go for. That's the procedure, the ritual that you go for. Even if that were the case, you should not automatically conclude that a Baal Mum would be allowed to do this. Maybe we would only be allowed to use Kohanim who are Tamimim, Kohanim who don't have a mum. And maybe the halacha was originally at the time of the Beis Hamikdash that only non-blemished Kohanim could do this. How do you know? You're trying to tell me that it's such an important mitzvah, that it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The fact it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai doesn't mean we're going to allow a Baal Mum to do it. I mean, there are all sorts of involved mitzvahs in the Beis Hamikdash, which are min HaTorah, which a Baal Mum is prohibited in doing. Maybe he would not be allowed to circumnavigate the Mizbeach, which involved him going between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. That's what the Gemara means to say over here. Anyway, so we've had here a little Gemara, Machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And again, it was really an attempt to try to re-establish the history of this procedure of this Arava, this mysterious ceremony, which we've described in various ways. We're still not conclusive on how the ceremony took place, and therefore whether Kohanim Baal Mumin were allowed to do it as well, whether it was just the erection against the side, whether it was a complete circumnavigation and hakofa. All this has come back to haunt us yet again. We thought we had actually solved it a few weeks ago. In fact, interestingly enough, the Gemara had previously said to Yufta, it had proved one way that it was to do with both hakofot plus erecting it. And over here, the Gemara has come back as if with a guilty conscience. The reason that this has happened, I think, is because, again, we would say when you're learning Gemara, there's really no before or after. These are all, if you like, transcripts of discussions had in the yeshiva. They're not written down in some sort of chronological order. So it could be that the fact that the Gemara is now uncertain of what the ceremony was, whereas before we seem to have reached a position of certainty, only shows that this Gemara, this discussion took place before the previous Gemara in the Beis HaMedrash, which seemed to establish some level of certainty. But it's one of the problems with learning Gemara, that you feel that you've come to a conclusion, and then you seem to sometimes unwind the conclusion, which is a bit unwelcome. Okay, I'm going to close the recording if I can find the button.